Take it away, Carol.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's here tonight to talk about soil. Before I start, I want to say that Laura Lant contributed to our earlier little chat about soil. She wrote in the chat, in case you can't see it, we've got clay and hardpan with wetland wetness around us. That's a challenging situation. We've started raised beds. So that's one example of why raised beds can be really useful. And surrounded them with chip drop wood chips. And I always wonder if you need a soil test on every bed. They're all so different. It would get pretty pricey. Usually what you do is mix your soil from each bed and look up, I'll have a link to how to do that sampling. If you have some beds, like half the beds are similar and another half of the beds are similar, you could you could do 2 samples. If they're really different, it depends on how they're different, I guess. But if you have put different soil into every bed, then that would make a difference, I would think. And if you have put different amendments into every bed, then that might make a difference. But you can group the similar ones together. So let's talk more about soil tonight. Let's see if I can get it to switch. Okay, tonight we're going to talk about organic versus synthetic, because you always hear that and we think organic is the thing that's frequently recommended, right? And soil seems really inert, but it's super busy actually. We're going to learn about who is in there running your garden and talk a little bit about soil tests. I'm just going to try to show you how you can make getting a soil test easier for yourself and understand it better, but I'm not going to go into great detail. And then how to grow soil amendment and suppress weeds over winter. So, here is a little misunderstanding that I'd like to clear up. We were all taught this in 6th grade or something. Plants make their own food. They don't make all their own food. They only make one thing as a basic building block. So they take in carbon dioxide, carbon and oxygen, and then they take in hydrogen and oxygen from water, and they rip them apart and they spit out some oxygen. And then for themselves, it shows it coming out, but they mostly keep this. That's just sugar. So what photosynthesis makes is sugar. Then they can stack that together and make starch, like in potatoes. They can rip it apart and they can make a few vitamins. There are a couple of vitamins that they can make just by rearranging those atoms. But there's a lot that they can't make because a lot of things are not made of just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So I mentioned this because I've had some new growers say, I put raised bed mix in my beds 4 years ago, and my plants just are not growing now. And I say, what fertilizers and amendments have you been adding? And they said, I didn't know you needed to, because I thought plants basically took what was available in the soil and made their own food. So they can't do that unless it's in there. So let's look at that. So the upper left, this is chlorophyll. So see these nitrogens and magnesium in the middle? This is the thing that runs plants. It captures the sunlight. If the plant doesn't have nitrogen and magnesium, this isn't going to happen. This is an amino acid or a piece of it. See all that nitrogen in there? That's why a plant needs that nitrogen, because amino acids make proteins and plants need those to run their bodies. All of the protein in our body has nitrogens from plants that somebody ate. I either ate them, you ate them, the cow that you ate them. So that's the only place we get it is through our diet, and the only place that the plant can get it is from the soil. They're not making their own. And down here are, of course, lots and lots of minerals that are really important to the function of plants, but also our own nutrition. So we're talking about making a healthier garden in order to make our bodies healthier, basically. And all of that comes from soil. So every single nutrient in the soil has a whole bunch of jobs. So I'm not going to go through every nutrient and show you what they're doing, or even through calcium and like read all of this. I just want you to see how much calcium is responsible for. It drives part of the amino acid and protein formation stuff. It makes your pickles cell walls crisp, and a cell wall that's stronger is going to fight pathogens more effectively. It's what prevents blossom end rot on tomatoes and all kinds of stuff. So all of these nutrients really matter. And this is how nutrients used to cycle. We had animals, whether they were domestic or wild, and of course they either died or produced waste products, and that was broken down by bacteria and stuff in the soil, and then it just went around in the cycle again. It was not called organic gardening, which it's now called, or organic farming. It was just called the way things work, because we literally didn't have any synthetics. We didn't know how to make this cycle happen artificially. So then this happened. This person is isolating nitrogen from the air in a process that we figured out how to do in the 1800s. And it was expensive and not seen as very necessary because people had mixed farms. So they had a lot of manure from their animals and it went onto their crops. If they were just a crop farm, their neighbor had animals. So we had this economy of waste products that allowed us to do this inexpensively, and people were not spending a lot of effort to get hold of synthetic nitrogen. But then something happened, and it caused, so this is my puzzle that I give every year. It caused a lot of nitrogen production. So here's the puzzle. I'll tell you that the federal government funded 5 giant nitrogen isolating plants very quickly. And they were nowhere near the coast of the US. And it happened in 1945 or 1940s, I should say, not 45. So I imagine you've guessed that we wanted the nitrogen for making bombs. So the N in TNT stands for nitrogen, so, or nitro. And we were also isolating phosphorus because that's for incendiary devices. So we, at the end of World War II, we had lots of ability to isolate nitrogen, and we didn't need it for defense anymore. So our farmers could do well by doing good because the whole world was starving from that conflict, lots of places anyway. And we could grow a lot of food if we use these synthetics. We did some other things in addition to using synthetic fertilizers. We developed soil testing because we had to teach farmers how to use those synthetic fertilizers. And we bred plants that could use the supercharged power of these synthetic concentrated fertilizers to grow bigger. So a lot of times when they grew bigger, let's take wheat, the kernel got bigger, but the kernel gets bigger at a higher rate than the outer surface does. And the B vitamins are in the outer surface. The protein is in the germ, and other B vitamins are in there. Those did not increase. What increased was the starch. So we had plants that could handle this, but they didn't have the complex soil life going on because we were using synthetics. And they were bred to manage to produce more. And certainly it made a lot of calories, which was great. And there were, there are some amazing advancements. I'm not saying it's all just starch, but one of the things that we happen to have seen after this happened was that. So there are our nutrients, and you might think that this was maybe just one study, but it's actually several studies. I don't expect you to read all of this, but maybe you could skim it. I have an article that these have come from. So these are multiple studies. I like the last one says that in order to have as much vitamin A as our grandparents would have gotten from one orange, we would need to eat 8 oranges. So if we're neglecting amendments to the soil, we're learning more now that we can improve the nutrition in plants and have a happier garden, healthier garden by building our soil ecosystem back again. So we're learning about that. So before we talk about that, I just want to go over what's the difference in a fertilizer and an amendment. A fertilizer is concentrated and it can be organic or synthetic. And we know how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in it. So organic examples are like fish emulsion. It'll say 703 or something like that on the front, and that tells you the concentration. Amendments are not as concentrated, and they often either have a variable nutrient profile in them, as far as the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or we don't even know because we made our own compost or something like that. Sometimes they're just minerals, like it'll be green sand or lime or something, and you put that in. That's also considered an amendment. So let's look at this. Okay. So healthy soil, if it is given organic material, actually does digestion because it's not just bits of sand, right? There are living organisms in there and a lot of them. So when we put corn husks or melon rinds or something into our compost piles, we think that we can't digest that. That is fiber that would go right through us. But the bacteria in the soil can digest it. They actually can digest it. Like a horse or a deer can digest fiber that you can't digest. It's similar to that. And we call that carbon. So we say corn husks or corn cobs or peels and things. We say sometimes if those are just fibrous or like leaves, we say that's carbon. That is carbohydrate for them. So organic fertilizers and amendments feed the soil. That goes into the soil here. It gets actually digested by microorganisms like bacteria. And the plants can't take it up when it first goes in. It has to be eaten. And then those bacteria either die or excrete it, and the plants can take it up. Synthetic fertilizers are water soluble. They don't go into the bacteria in the same way, into the microorganisms in the same way. Oops. And they are immediately soluble, so they can be taken up by the plants. That's why synthetic fertilizer boxes say water, apply, and water again, because you don't want a concentrated version of that synthetic fertilizer to get sucked up by the plant. So on the left, the organic stuff is really analogous, if you think about this, to your gut bacteria. We used to think we had bacteria sort of incidentally in our guts, but they are digesting our food and creating products for us that we are then absorbing. And we're just realizing that it's very much more complex. It's like it's the stomach of the plant or the intestines of the plant, the soil. Synthetic fertilizer, the organic stuff on the left is like saying, I need sugar and vitamin C for my day. I'm going to eat an orange. And on the right, it's like saying the same thing and having some vitamin C powder and sugar and stirring it up and eating it. You can still drinking it. You can still get it, but it's a different process. So that's just a little reminder that the soil is the stomach for your plants. And it's a very, very busy digestive system. And it's really cool. So what I hope I'm going to do tonight, what I am going to do tonight, is reinforce a lot of things that you're already doing and maybe explain why you're doing them so that when you are doing them, you have different motivation and a better understanding. I hope it's a richer experience. It's not, I'm not going to tell you have to do this one weird trick or something. It's a deeper understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it, I think. And also some stuff to do that you might want to consider doing. So even the USDA, which is scientifically careful, they like to see data before they make proclamations, they declare soil to be a vital living ecosystem. And we used to say that it was like a substrate from which plants could absorb nutrients. So how can we have healthy soil? We can understand what the inorganic parts of our soil do. Sand is the coarsest part of a lot of soil. We hate sand because it drains too fast, but we love it because if we put some in there and our soil isn't draining, then it'll help drainage. Clay, on the other hand, is the tiniest particle, and clay holds moisture and it holds nutrients, which can be frustrating if all you have is clay because it's going to be claggy. But if you don't have any clay in your soil, it can drain too fast again. So everything has its function, and silt is kind of in between those two in terms of function and structure, size. You'll hear a word called loam. It's the mix of those three, plus some organic matter. Do you notice that that is not a powder in this guy's hand? Loam is chunky, and the chunks are very important. So we don't want to break those up. Let's look at this. Okay, so here's why silt and sand and clay are different. Sand is really big and it's a crystal. Oops. It's crystalline, so nothing can soak in. It's a tiny rock. The only place that nutrients can be held on sand are on the outside. In fact, for any of these, the only place that nutrients can be held are on the outside. But clay is so tiny that if you had a ball of clay this big, it would be made of 1 billion particles, or 1 million, whatever. 1 million particles of clay, each particle can hold nutrients on its outside. In fact, this is what clay looks like. So every one of those little slip chips there, those slim chips, holds nutrients in between and on its surface. So that's why clay is really good at holding nutrients, and also why it's slippery, because it's made out of basically Pringles. So do you see that there's a little minus sign next to all of these? That is why positively charged things like minerals will stay in your soil, because positively charged stuff will stick to the negative surfaces of all these things. So they stay in the soil more easily. And I'll tell you what's negatively charged in a little while. Negatively charged stuff is not going to stay in the soil that easily. If you're desperate to figure out your soil texture because you figure that it's, you think it's compacted clay, but maybe it's not, I have a resource page link, and you'll find the resource page link in the chat. On that page is a really easy way to test what your soil texture is. I don't usually do that. I just say start digging, add compost, put some fertilizer in, and see what you can grow. But if you've been frustrated by the density of your soil or something like that, it's very simple to do this test. And it's a home test, and you don't have to buy anything. We're going to see the word tilth a lot. It just means like nice soil. It won't break your fork when you dig it. It does not have to be as soft as coffee grounds, but it's diggable. Dark color, smells good. You can see bits of dead stuff in it, and it's got air in it. Soil can be up to 30% air. It also has aggregates. So what are aggregates? Aggregates are chunks. So some people might remember, maybe their grandparents, rototilling the garden until it was powder and thinking, this is such great soil. That was a misunderstanding. We don't want it to break. We need it to communicate. We need one part of the soil to communicate with another part of the soil. The chunks of soil are important. So we're going to treat our soil more gently. So here's a close-up of really little aggregates, and this is why we need them. There are spaces from which extra water can drain, but there are tiny spaces, oops, oversensitive keypad. There are tiny, tiny spaces. Those little tiny holes will hold water. See the orange dots? Those are bacteria that are breaking down nutrients in the soil to share with your plants. And those bacteria are also making sticky stuff that causes the aggregates to hold together. And they also can hold moisture into the ground. Those white tendrils are not roots. They're hyphae or mycelia. Those are two technically different names for basically the stringy fungus under the ground. That stringy fungus is actually the body of the whole fungus. If you see a mushroom on top, I used to think that's the plant, like that's the body, and the roots are underground. That's not true. The body is underground, and the mushroom's just the fruit, like a peach on a peach tree. So these fungal strands are really important, and I'll tell you about them in a little bit. There are also bigger things that you can learn about inside your soil, not just the physical structure of your soil, but we're starting to talk about the living things in your soil. So in no way are we going to memorize what's in your soil, because there are billions of different species in soil. Even a little bit of soil has that. But fungus and bacteria, we tend to think, oh, that must be bad. But that is the basis. Everything else is eating because the fungus and bacteria have broken down the nutrients, but also often they are eating the fungus and bacteria. That's what they're going after. Also, actinomycetes, microorganism, actinomycetes. You know that great smell of perfect soil? It's the exhalation of actinomycetes. It's the gases that they produce. It's what you're smelling. So they're friendly and they're nice. I'll say it that way. So look, this is really true. Just a little bit of soil has billions of bacteria and millions of protozoa and nematodes, which are tiny worms and things like that. So it is busy, and the cellular processes that are going on there, when it's warm, can go very fast. So it's like a trillion little machines going, doing things in your soil. Oh, I'm going to explain that fungus now. Isn't this a lot of roots on this seedling? So many roots, but it's not roots, it's fungus. So here is, trees are particularly fond of fungus, fungal relationships. So here is a tree that has produced some sugar through photosynthesis, and it pushes a little bit of that sugar out of its roots. And if there's a fungal spore living there, that fungus then gets to be more successful because it's eating some sugar. So it gets to divide and divide and divide and divide, and it grows out into the soil. But the original strand is connected back to the roots of the tree. So that strand of fungus, all of those things that look like roots that are fungi, are mining the soil for nutrients, which get back toward the roots, and they get shared just through diffusion with the plant. And plants that have these relationships have much better drought tolerance. They have much better nutrient mining, obviously, and they can even communicate with other plants. So one plant gets damaged, it makes defensive chemicals. The plants nearby, if they can communicate through their roots and fungi, will produce defensive chemicals even if there's no pest on them. So they can tell, they can communicate. Happens a lot with trees, like our fruit trees and other plants as well. Bacteria can actually put nitrogen into your soil. You're breathing 76% nitrogen every day, and so are plants. And plants and humans cannot get it out of the air. It's totally the thing that makes protein. Protein's based on nitrogen, and we totally need it. The only guys who can get it out of the air are bacteria. So the air gets into the soil, the bacteria take it in, and they change it into a form that plants can use. So we really need those bacteria. Some of those bacteria actually live inside of roots in very special relationships with only certain kinds of plants. And those plants are generally called legumes. So there are a few trees, but in our garden, it's going to be peas, beans, alfalfa, and vetch. Vetch is kind of like a pea vine. And these little nodules that you see up here, these are plant tissue, but it's specifically grown in response to the bacteria touching those roots. And then they grow, and the bacteria have a place to live. They get sugar from the plant, and they fix nitrogen for the plants so they can use it. Plants that have bacterial relationships, not in their roots, but on their roots, where they're covered in certain kinds of bacteria, they can produce biogums. Those bacteria produce that, and they hold moisture really well. So plants, it's been shown that plants that have those relationships, like cotton plants that do have that, and cotton plants that don't have that bacteria in their soil, the ones that do are more drought resistant. So that could be really important to us globally when we are seeing more droughts. Also, the more organic matter you have in your soil, as you might know from videos that are out lately, when we put organic matter into our soil, more roots, more plants, more organisms, we are harboring carbon in the soil. So it's a carbon sink. Okay, so I'm not going to teach you about the carbon cycle, but remember how there's a water cycle and a carbon cycle and all that? Everything's a cycle. So see all these cycles? In no way am I going through these cycles. I just like to point out that there's a cycle for just about everything. And look how much of each cycle depends on the organisms under the ground. So when we're out there in our gardens, it matters what we do. And we can thank all of these organisms that are under the ground and think about how what we do can support them. So how do we do that? So I'm going to say, first, do no harm. I bet most of these things on here you would know. Herbicides and pesticides tend to kill off, things that kill life, kill life. So minimizing those, going without them if you can, is good. Tillage, minimizing tillage is good. Gentle tillage if you're going to turn soil, leaving the big pieces. I'll talk about that a little bit in the future. You could go down to zero till, no till. Some manures are very salty. Like if you get steer manure straight from a feedlot, that can be very salty. Most people don't have a problem with that, but typically that's what you see in the literature. And using synthetic fertilizers, especially when you're neglecting organic matter. But, yeah. Let's see, do we have any questions, John? Should I take a breath and let somebody get a word in edgewise?
Let me look.
I don't see any, but do let me know because I am going on.
All right.
Here's something we can do to help our little ecosystem. We can prevent soil compaction. So we don't walk in our beds. That's why we have beds 3 to 4 feet wide. And you want to, if you're putting in a new garden, you might spend quite a bit of time crouched down, imagining yourself having to reach 2 feet out or 1.5 feet out and decide how wide those beds should be. So if you're ever hand weeding, you might sit for a while and go, okay, I'm going to hand weed everything 2 feet away from me and see if I can handle that for, half an hour and see how your back feels. So staying out of the beds is a great thing as much as you can. Of course, adding compost. And if you dig it when it's moist, not sopping wet and not bone dry, because that allows those aggregates, it allows the soil to hold together better. But if it's very wet and you're manipulating it, it's going to squish and stick together and just drive all the air pockets out. It's a great way to make bricks. So yeah, do it when it's moist. There's a test for that. You squeeze a handful of it, you open up your hand. If it goes to powder when you open up your hand, it's too dry. If it stays in a chunk when you open up your hand and you poke it and it just squishes, that's too wet. But if you poke it and it sort of falls into 2 chunks, then you're good. And we can also consider no-till or low-till growing. So less digging, which is good news, right? That's easier, right? What I would love you to tell me is, how do you till? Even if you say I yearly turn my soil into to powder, and I love it. You know, you want to say wrong. So I need somebody to be brave enough to tell me how much, what do you do? Do you do nothing? Do you till gently? Do you thoroughly turn it over?
I'll go.
Yeah.
Let's see, Carol. If we're doing a new bed, we dig down a little bit because we have some hard pan pretty close to the surface, and we typically have to add a lot of material, 10 to 12 inches above that at least. And but once we've established the bed, we pretty much just keep adding in more organic material, the nutrients, the amendments, that sort of stuff, and we kind of just turn it into the that top little bit, but we try not to disturb it very much once it's established.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I do too. When I'm establishing a bed, especially in what's basically subsoil, because when they put your house in, you know, they scooch the topsoil over to the side. So you've got stuff that doesn't even have organic matter in it. And so I meet new gardeners and they want to grow something this year, right? They don't want to like put 3 inches of compost on and, you know, lasagna garden, and then a year and a half from now they can do it. So I say, do dig it as deeply as you can, loosen it up, turn some compost and fertilizer in. That's basically what you do. I probably actually do a little more digging, like a little more incorporation than you do even in following years. You put it into you dig a little bit in the surface soil to dig it in.
It depends on what the soil's like to begin with. If the hard pan's real close, we dig down a little deeper.
Yeah.
If there's a lot of clay in it, we try to mix that with a little bit with sand. And we try to do as much amending as we can that initial digging, so we don't have to disturb it later once we get it established.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Katie says, I use a hand rake on raised beds to loosen up the top a little and mix in compost. Cool. A lot of advice says you can mix in, you know, to the top 7 inches. But even then, I mean, you can even do it deeper. Some people do go really deep, but they don't disturb it very much. And I'll show you that in just a second about that. Laura wants to know, can I start or what do we think about starting seedlings in a synthetic thing like Miracle Grow and then pop them into an organic bed? Do you think they recover? Oh, I mean, anything you do to support the organisms in the bed, I would say, tell me what you think, experienced gardeners. Your bed is going to try to populate that Miracle Grow, little bit of Miracle Grow soil, and your plants are going to grow out into it. I don't use Miracle Grow. I use an organic soil, you know, I basically make my own soil starting, plant starting stuff. Yeah, but I think a lot of plants you get in like big box stores have been synthetically grown, and then they get into the organic soil. It's certainly not exactly the same. Organic growers will say you shouldn't do that, but I find it successful. And did everybody else find that works? Maybe nobody has an opinion. Okay. Yeah, we're saying go for it. But I would say also maybe, Laura, look into maybe some more organic stuff that you could get. Does Miracle Grow hurt the soil? Well, organic stuff will be more likely to support organisms that want to digest it. And Miracle Grow bypasses that. So to what extent does it hurt the soil? I can't really speak to that, but it's just not supporting bacterial relationships. On the other hand, if you have sterile seed mix that you buy, even if it's from, you know, entirely organic stuff, and you're putting in soluble organic fertilizer, you probably are not, you don't have a lot of microorganism activity in that soil anyway. So they've gotten started, and then you're going to pop them in the garden and they're going to be okay. That's what I'm going to say. unless, oh, like, you're asking Laura if you've poisoned it. I think you're fine. Just support organics as much as you can. I mean, if that's what you want to do. Yeah. Okay.
Carol, there's a question
You can,
back there from John McInnes as well, about raised beds versus native soils.
oh my gosh. John, you have active compost that you've made at home, right?
Yes, yes,
You're going to be putting that in there, right?
yes, along with alpaca manure because that's very soft manure. It's not
Yeah.
it's not hot, and as well as other things, the fish compost, that type of thing. But yeah, I will put some of my own compost in there for sure.
Yeah, you're gonna have a plenty of organisms in there. But I don't know as compared to the native soil. But if you're worried that you won't have as many, it's gonna be ripping. I think it'll be great.
Okay, well, my question was how long does it kind of get to that level of what you showed there on your little diagrams with all the little critters all over the place. So that would be, I guess, a year or two.
Well, when you compost, the things that are breaking down your compost are organisms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you are putting in lots of them, and they reproduce really fast. So certainly as it matures, as your garden matures, which organisms are dominant in there will probably change, because you're going to get organic materials breaking down more, so you get more humic acid and stuff like that in there. So the profile will change, but I would think that the overall activity would be high pretty early. The
Okay.
activity of breaking down nutrients. But in any ecosystem, it's going to progress. So you're going to see that the texture of your soil changes and all kinds of stuff like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I hope that was clear enough. So yeah, I bet you've already read these. It holds air, water, and nutrients, basically. And the more diverse the ecosystem in any system, the more resilient it is to all kinds of changes, which is relevant to climate change. So that is just an ecological principle if you have a diverse ecosystem in your soil. So how we're going to feed it is, one major thing you can do is when you take your plants out in the fall or whenever you take them out, cut them off the roots and leave the roots in there, because the roots have made great headway into the soil. A carrot that is like 8 inches long can have roots feet and feet and feet into the soil, because that carrot is not the root. And when you pull it out, you think, oh, it's just got a few roots on it. They're all left behind. So can an onion plant. Just any plant can have so many tendrils of roots into the soil. If you cut that plant off, provided it doesn't have a root disease, if you cut it off and it rots into the soil, you have basically it's like digging organic matter into your soil. So over winter, it's going to rot, and it's going to feed the soil microbes, and it's going to create nutrients it's going to release nutrients into your soil. You can, of course, add compost. So I don't know if you add compost every year, but early on when you have super lean soil, you can do 3 to 4 inches in the first year. And then I really was very aggressive about composting my garden. So I probably did 2 or 3 inches for several years. I slightly overdid it, because see the little critter in the lower right corner? If you get very, very compost rich soil, you can sometimes get too many of those. It's not a springtail, it's a symphilin, and they will nibble the roots of things. So I had a little nibbling, and I thought, I think I know what's going on here. My garlic wasn't doing well, and I carefully scooped it out and took a look, and I thought, yep, I was I've done too good a job, and that's nature's way of saying thank you. So I backed off on the compost. So you have to get your compost in your soil to the degree that it just needs like 5%, 5 to 10% compost in your soil. 10 would be really, really high. And so adding more compost in the early couple of years and then tapering off probably, so that I think at times I just do half an inch of compost now in my beds because they're quite mature. And then we can consider low or no dig beds. So how do we do it? Oh, here's my question. What compost do you use? Does anybody have a compost that they particularly like? John was saying, did you say you got yours from Vern's, right?
I got some from Burns and some from Indigo.
Oh yeah, Indigo, yeah. So I don't need a brand necessarily, but does anybody have a particular compost? Do you make your own compost? I do both because I can't keep up. Katie says composted yard clippings and chicken manure. Cool. Oh, and Fran and Dave, you're using the fish compost from Tills, which is Oli fish, right? Oh, okay. You don't know. Okay. I'm watching you. I'm lip reading, Fran, because I can't hear you.
I think Till switched. They're making their own brand now.
Oh, okay. They used to do both, but I see. Maybe they, okay.
They didn't have the
switch
Oli the other day when I was there. I ended up with their brand of the fish.
Okay.
On most of that they
Okay.
do.
Yeah. There is another one called Olympic Organics. So there's Oli fish. That's made in Purdy. And then there's, oh, no, it's Belfair. Anyway, down there. But then there's another one called Olympic Organics that is in Kingston and Bremerton. And they use local waste from town and country and yard waste and a little bit of manure, but they're very careful at testing their manure to make sure it doesn't have a particularly persistent herbicide called clopyralid or aminopyralid. Anyway, so I have a chart on the resources page, and a couple of years ago, the prices on this chart were accurate, but I did not update them by making phone calls this year. So they're approximate, but there's a big old chart. If you click on the resources page, you can take a look. Laura says food waste, pasteurized steer manure. Cool. Start a new bed with fresh food scraps at the bottom and then cover with good garden soil mixed with manure. That sounds yummy. Sounds fun. So let me point out something else. I have to go backward if that makes you queasy. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to show you what a little bit of digging looks like. This guy may very well have dug very deeply to loosen this up years ago. And maybe he put fertilizer and compost on at that time and dug it over and over, right? So he thoroughly loosened that soil. But in future years, like this year, he probably just put his fertilizer on for the spring and his compost on. So you don't put the fertilizer and dig and then compost and dig. Just put it all on at once. And then he put this fork in as deeply as he could put it in. And then he just pulls back on the handle. It's called popping. And it just aerates the soil, but it leaves it in a chunk. And then he moves it back a foot and he stands on it so he can get it in as far as he can. And then he pulls back. And so he's just lifting and aerating the soil so it's not too compacted. And that is a way to let some air in, but not too much. And give crevices so that the fertilizer and compost can get in there. And but still be fairly gentle with the soil. Let's see where I was. Okay, keep going. Okay, nitrogen. Remember how I said those particles in the soil, the inorganic parts, were all negatively charged? So anything positive like calcium will stick and it'll stay in your soil pretty well. Nitrogen is negative too, so it doesn't stick to the soil particles. And also at room temperature, nitrogen loves to float off into the air because it's a gas. So it can rinse out in the rain. It can, if you left manure on the surface of your fresh manure on the surface of your garden, you could lose like, I think it's half the nitrogen in it in 24 hours. So it loves to get out of there, loves to escape. So you can incorporate organic matter gently if you're doing that. Some people, if they don't want to dig, they'll put their high nitrogen stuff on the surface of the soil, and then they'll put compost on top of that. That's one way to do it. Till less or no more than you feel you need to do. And we can add nitrogen in the spring. Other calendars for the national and the UK will say put well-rotted manure on your beds in the winter or in the fall so that the frost heave can mix them. But that doesn't happen here. What happens here is rain rinse. So we put our nitrogen amendments on in the springtime so we don't lose it. And it doesn't wash into the water table and into the creeks and poison the creeks. We can time our nitrogen for growing leaves versus fruit. So your tomato plants, you want them to get really big and then set tomatoes, right? So nitrogen makes things grow vegetatively, so stems and leaves. So that's great for that part of the tomato season. But as it sets its tomatoes, I personally don't add nitrogen because I had pretty good nitrogen at the beginning. Some people will continue to fertilize little by little, but once those tomatoes are set on there, the nutrients that are in the plant should go into those tomatoes. The point of the plant is to give itself up for its babies, basically. So you don't want, at the end of the season, a perfectly green, continuing to produce lots of leaves tomato plant. I hope that's not too extreme a statement. So we time to get a big plant to grow, but once the fruit is ripening, I don't necessarily want to tell the plant you should grow more leaves and more leaves and more leaves. I do want to tell that to my kale that's been growing all spring and all summer, and I think I can keep that kale going all winter, right? I want it to do a big growth flush in fall, so I have lots of kale to eat over winter. I'm going to side dress that kale with nitrogen, scratch it into the surface, make sure it's well watered, because that gives the plant a sense of safety as well. And I'm going to mulch the ground to keep it cool so that plant continues to grow vegetatively and gives me a good meal. So there are times that we do fall or even very early spring nitrogen application, but that's to get when we know we want to get leaves. And you can gently incorporate your high nitrogen amendments that I spoke about. And mulch. Mulched beds have more microorganisms in them because they're not getting that stress of drying out, getting wet, drying out, getting wet, getting hot, getting, all that. That safe, stable environment is really good. And you can consider cover crops. Let's see. Does anybody have anything you want to disagree with on here? Oh, Fran wants to know, what are your nitrogen amendments? People, tell me what your nitrogen amendments are. I will say some of them. Blood meal, if you don't object, if you're a meat eater, and that is a product of the production of your meat. Fish emulsion is one of them. Cottonseed meal, you'd have to ask around. I don't have a source for cottonseed meal. Cottonseed meal can have a fair amount of pesticide in it. So sometimes you can find organic cottonseed meal. You can find mixes at the store that are high nitrogen mixes that have like ground up fish waste. There's fish meal and things like that. What else? Give me some other ones. Help me. What do you use for your nitrogen on your plants? Growers.
How about bone meal? Does that work?
Bone meal doesn't have, it does have some nitrogen in it. What is the NPK on bone meal? Anybody know? Do you ever have some? It's generally calcium and phosphorus. John's going to Google it. It generally is high in calcium and phosphorus. And bones do have protein, but I don't know if the production results in very much nitrogen in any bone meal product. Oh, John.
It is, hold on just a second. I just went to the wrong place. 315.0 is what it says.
Oh, okay. So that's high in phosphorus, but it also has calcium in it that's not listed in that NPK. So it has a little bit of nitrogen. It's from the fact that bones are made of protein, partly, mostly. So we don't have any others. There is some nitrogen in alfalfa meal. It's not the highest, but it has some growth stimulant hormones in it as well, so they say. So you can look up that as well. You know what, Fran? Would you be comfortable emailing me and asking me to include a nitrogen, organic sources of nitrogen link for you? I think I have one.
Right.
In addition to those things that I said. Thank you. My email is in the comments. So blood meal, bone meal has more phosphorus and calcium, not much nitrogen or potassium. Blood meal is very high nitrogen because of the protein. Anything that has protein is from a protein source is going to have higher nitrogen. Coffee grounds have some nitrogen. It takes a long time for them to break down, but they have nitrogen. And I don't know what the phosphorus and potassium are in coffee grounds. We can try cover crops. Remember I told you that some plants, I mean, you probably already knew this, legumes, alfalfa, vetch, peas, and beans, they actually have that bacterial relationship where they take nitrogen out of the air. It's not the plant doing it, the bacteria does it, but the plant takes it up and it puts it into its body. So the leaves and stems and beans are high in protein, right? All of those parts have higher nitrogen than other plants do generally, which is why the rabbits are going after your peas and your beans and your vetch. If I have vetch growing in the garden, they will eat that, and there's like a whole bed of lettuce next to them, and they don't even notice it because they're looking for that protein. So cover crops are crops that you grow not to consume yourself, but so that you can basically grow fertilizer for your garden. You can grow fertilizer, you can suppress weeds, you can, if you just want to hold the nutrients in a bed over winter, you can grow a cover crop in the fall. It will hold the nutrients over winter in its body. And then you mow it down really like as close as you can to the ground in spring. And it's traditional to turn it under, like just to like work it just into the soil. You just want to be able to put it under the soil so the soil microorganisms can get it. Some growers mow it down and leave it as a top mulch. You're going to lose nutrients like nitrogen to the air, but if people who are really dedicated to never turning their soil at all, that you'll see them do that. Some people mow it, chop it up, and then put compost over the top. But typically, traditionally, we turn that slightly to get at least some of it into the soil. So it enters the ecosystem in the soil. So some cover crops do that nitrogen fixing. That's what that's called, where you actually get more nitrogen in the bed by the end of its growing period than you had before, because it's pulled out of the air. Some crops don't do that, like ryegrass won't do it, buckwheat doesn't do it. But what those do is they do produce carbon. So like compost, the carbon part of compost, and there's some nitrogen in those plants. So you can at least increase the carbon in your bed if you cover crop. So it's just something to put in your quiver. maybe you're thinking, oh, this isn't me, I'm not a cover crop person, but you're going to learn a little bit now. Maybe you look at the video another time, you read something, and you at least are better informed about whether you're going to make that choice. Yeah, they're definitely feeding the ecosystem when you turn those in. Some cover crops are summer ones, like buckwheat. If you have a bed that you just don't want to use right now, or you can't use that area, then buckwheat is a warm weather crop. But a lot of them you plant in autumn, and then they take the bed over and they keep the weeds up and they produce good stuff. What they don't do is they create minerals out of thin air. The only thing that plants pull in out of thin air is carbon and oxygen. And then they get the nitrogen through their bacterial relationships. But plants can mine deeply, deeply into the subsoil. And sometimes there'll be nutrients in the subsoil, minerals, that they will pull up into your topsoil, so then you can plant. That's why tree leaves are really great in compost, because the trees go way down and then they bring it all up into their leaves and then they give it to you. So they're really helping to mix those nutrients in the ecosystem. This is from Tilth Alliance. There is a link for Tilth on the resource page. These pictures are from Tilth. I stole them, but in exchange, I am recommending that you get familiar with Tilth. It's an amazingly knowledgeable organization, super powerful. So here's a person who is cutting her cover crop off, and her cover crop looks like it's a mix of a vetch and a grass. I think probably winter rye or something, and she's cutting it off. I grab the heads and I slice with like a kitchen knife to cut it off. You could mow it, you could strim it, anything like that. You want to get it really far down, like further than it appears, further down than it appears that she's doing. And then this person is turning it into the bed so that at least some of it is covered up. Some people perfectly bury all of it. So the reason we're cutting it off is we want to kill it. We do not want it to keep going, because then we can't plant into it and it's going to compete. So we want it to die and rot. So we want an annual cover crop, not alfalfa, because alfalfa is perennial. So when you go to a nursery, we want to ask them, maybe call around, do you have a lot of cover crop seeds? Can you give me guidance? And then you can go into one where they say yes to both of those. Some people who don't want to ever dig in their beds put a lot of burlap over the top to get the plants to die. And Fran, I would think cardboard would be similar. Cardboard is a little bit more air excluding, and I think the reason they are using the burlap is they want that aerobic action, but still, air's getting in there. So this is a scary looking cover crop chart, but really it's just telling you, like, does it give you nitrogen? Is right here. Does it choke out weeds really well, right? And so some of the things are not relevant to you, but there's a link for this, and you'll find it at nurseries sometimes. The Bay Hay has this chart available, and also they can tell you about stuff. Your nursery person can tell you about these things too. Do you have anything to say? John has posted a link to the Tilth Alliance resources on composting methods and bins. Nice. And tilthalliance.org. Thank you. And Laura says, thoughts for flower and veggie patches. Still seeds. Oh, right. So Laura wants to know, what if you want seeds to germinate, but you're amending your soil and you're covering things up? Do you know what I do? Tell me what you do. Let me think about this. What do I do? I leave some bare patches in my ornamental beds where I don't amend over the top. I will sometimes take some flower seeds that I know, I've gathered, and I'll put them in that patch, and then I'll amend around that. But are you talking about flowers that cannot be covered? Like nasturtium flowers have to be covered in order to germinate.
I'm just talking about anything that wants to self-seed that I
Mhm.
love, but I also collect seeds too, and
Mhm.
I'll throw them out in the spring. But
Yeah.
I also want to encourage anybody who happened to fall off in the fall to get rolling.
You mean to get rolling in,
Germ-
any
Yep.
seeds that fell off in the fall? Right. Yeah. Some things need to be covered with something like nasturtiums won't germinate if they're just sitting out. They need the darkness. But you're right, you do lose some seeds. So what I have done is put leaves down in the fall and left patches open so that flower seeds that are in my beds just generally will germinate. I generally don't have a problem with the flower seeds germinating. Gardeners, or I'm not very much of an ornamentalist. So ornamentalists, what do you do? Do you put your compost down in the late summer before the seeds fall, and then you just give them a little bit of extra nitrogen in the spring? We'll see if anybody comes up with anything. Okay, Laura?
Thank you.
Okay. Mulch, I just want to show you some mulch. Generally, with vegetables, we don't want wood chips in the veg. There are permaculturists who use wood chips on the surface, but that's a very specific way of gardening. They're not digging them in, because if you put a lot of tough carbon into the soil, it's going to use up the nitrogen in the soil as everything in there tries to decompose it. So usually we want something that'll decompose within a year, something easy. So leaves on the top if you're going to mulch. And what I do when I'm amending is if the leaves are still there's a lot of them and they're still very robust at the end of the fall, and I'm going to pull them off. I pull them off and then I amend the bed and I use them elsewhere, or I put them in the compost pile or something like that. And I have extra leaves, so I might even store them. And then once the temperatures warm up and the bed requires mulching again, because it's getting hot and I want to keep the roots safe, then I put that mulch back on. So I move my mulch around a lot. This kind of wood chip mulch with leafy green stuff in it and lots of like succulent twigs that are still fairly green is a favorite of fungus, and trees love fungal relationships. I'm not advocating, I'm not teaching about growing trees tonight, but and there's some people who say, oh no, don't put these chips on your trees. But I have found some success with that. You might want to get a soil test, especially if you've done maybe for 10 years, you put the same fertilizers on your soil and you're wondering, do I have too much phosphorus? Do I have too much of something and not enough of something else? And they can be intimidating. They'll tell you about pH. They'll give you recommendations about what to add, but they look like, how do you even know which one to order from this? So the basic one is at the beginning, and you can get one of these for, I think it's 25 bucks. The price may have gone up because they got much better technology, and they can test better. But this is the one that Kitsap Conservation District recommends that we use. But there are others. I have a link for this one in particular. If you're wondering, what's my pH of my soil? Lab is a better way to go than a home test kit. Labs are more reliable, and they can tell you lots of other stuff. But see how there's a whole list of stuff that you don't necessarily understand? you need somebody to walk you through because it's coming back with a report. Well, you turn it in with this report. That in itself is a lot of boxes. It could put you off if you were really busy and you didn't, you could procrastinate on that, I think. But your sample ID, what the heck is that? You just make up letters. So mine said veg and blueberries or veg and blues. And you just answer the questions as much as you can. So here I wrote, used to be, let me see, veg now, previous crop, lawn. It's not a big deal. And they're going to send you something that looks like that. That's tricky to interpret. Guess who is your best friend? These guys. This is part of TILF, the garden hotline. Will, if you call them and warn them, they will tell you how to email them the results of your soil test. And they will walk you through it and they will recommend what you should put on the garden. So I think that's pretty amazing. I've asked them about 10 times if they really mean it and they'll really do it. And they assure me that they will do it. So that's a treat for you, I think, for all of us. Let's see what else. Oh, want to get to know these things better? Here is a book that is kind of like tonight's course, but with a little bit more information, a little bit next step. You can get that at your local bookstore or Kitsap Regional Libraries. There are links on the resource page. There's also a link for this film, which is about globally how increasing the ecosystem and supporting the ecosystem in the soil can pull carbon out of the sky in a very meaningful way. And then, Fran, there was another one, the sequel to this. Do you remember the name of it?
Common Ground.
Common Ground. Right. So it's the sequel to this one. It was just shown on Bainbridge. I haven't seen it, but there's a book called Teaming with Microbes. There's another one called Teaming with Fungi. And if you want to go deeper in the weeds, what are these microbes and how can I support them? That is a good resource. I wonder if anybody wants to add anything else, anything you have observed, or make sure that I got to your questions. Oh, Fran says, you turned your crop under and it continued to grow. So I don't like to do it in the main season. Right. So did you cut it off right at the soil and flip it?
No. I just flipped it.
Cutting it off is definitely a way to thwart it. And when I am concerned with that, I put the shovel, not that you're going to do it, but if anybody else is wondering, I put a flat shovel underneath, like 2 inches down in the soil, and I flip it over and I make sure almost all of it is hidden so that it's now roots up, right? And most of its roots have been cut off. So those are my attempts. But yeah, some of them, you don't want to get something perennial. People were buying clovers that they thought were annual and they accidentally bought perennial clovers and it was a big trouble. So not that you did that, but that's a possibility. Yeah. What else? Can you just yell out if I didn't see your question or you want to tell us something, like something that I haven't covered that you want to share with us? Okay, have you looked at the resource page? Oh, was that a yes, Fran, or you want to say something? Go.
No, I want to ask, so I want to come back to what to do in late November, December with my bed.
Oh, the cardboard. Is that right?
Well, I want to know the variety of things. So one is to plant a cover crop. If I don't want to do that,
okay,
should I put leaves down? Is that better than putting down the cardboard? Or what are my options beside cover crop?
I think cardboard's better than plastic because you have the gas exchange. So some people do plastic. Sometimes I've done a little plastic somewhere, but I think cardboard is still pretty permeable. I think that's nice. I like that about it. I don't know if leaves are better. They definitely have more microbes in them, you know, and as they break down, they're probably going to influence, put more edible compounds into the soil a little bit. So I suppose they're incrementally better, but I don't know that I don't know if that's worth it to you to go hunting around for leaves.
Mhm.
Is it?
It'd be easy to get some leaves. I don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
Do I need to chop them up at all if they're maple leaves or something?
Well, being in a pea patch, you got two things with maple leaves is if they are soaking wet when you get them, they're going to laminate like this,
Mhm.
and you have just tons of them. In which case, I kind of feel like the cardboard might be better because this is very smothering.
Mhm.
And it's not, you're not going to ruin your soil. Tons of organisms are underneath this in the soil underneath laminated maple leaves now, right? Because that's what they do. If you get them dry, you know, on a really dry day when they're crackly and it's been dry for 5 days, so they're sort of coiled up, then they won't laminate. They
Mhm.
do blow around a little bit. So if you see anybody throwing out chopped leaves, like they have a riding mower that's chopping into a bag, you
Mhm.
could say, "Hi there, I have this gunny sack." I've done that. I've done a lot of stuff, like ask the Parks Department for them and stuff like that. So you can get them. And sometimes you'll see somebody has like a Japanese maple or elm or something, and it's not big leaf maple. And those don't blow around as much. Does anybody else have anything to offer Fran when it comes to leaves? John Fawcett says the master gardeners are having clinics on Thursdays, May through September from 3 to 5 at the branch, right? At Bainbridge?
That is correct, at the Bainbridge Library.
Nice. And John wants to know, what does vinegar do to soil? Well, it's acid, so it's going to interact with anything basic, and it's in the soil if there are any basic things, and it's going to usually make a salt, not table salt, but a salt. So I would not put a whole lot of that on my soil. I use it on like the driveway, but I don't use it on the soil. I imagine the soil can recover, but I mean, it's going to have some impact. It depends on how much you put on. Algae top crose that hits some wet beds. Oh, it's harmless. It's nutrient. Just maybe turn it under or it'll rot in on its own. Okay, let's look at this. What's next? Ta-da, June Veg Club. What's coming up is pests and diseases. Woohoo! How to recognize them and reduce them and live with them. Probably not as much living with them as warting. Oh, we want to talk. So this is next month. This is the subject of the next month's Veg Club, which is a Zoom. We're going to have a kind of a rogues gallery of pests and ideas about how to deal with them. So bring your ideas. I'll tell you, this one right here was not even in the United States until the 90s. And about 5 years ago, I called the Path Lab and I said, I think I've got this. Is that a thing? I mean, it wasn't even, I'd never even heard of it. And she was so excited. She said, send it to us. We're very excited. We have to monitor this. It's a bad thing, but they get very excited about it. So there might be stuff that you don't know. Maybe stuff you do know. Maybe you're great at fighting powdery mildew and you'd like to tell us about that. That would be super. We'd love to see you first Tuesday of every month. The link's on the resource page. It's also in the chat. Personally, I would put it in my calendar. So when the calendar link shows up, the location is the Zoom link. And Fran, you want to know about biochar. I don't have experience with biochar in a vegetable garden. I do know biochar has, I'm sure you know this, it has an unimaginable porosity. It's just so porous. It's got so many holes in it that we can't see. And all of that gives it an incredibly large surface area. So it's not just the outside, it's inside all of those holes. And the surface area holds nutrients. The way that I talked about clay holding nutrients, the charge on the surface area holds not just water, which is very nice, but nutrients. And you only have to put biochar in once because it does not decay. So I saw some research that said it's possible to put too much biochar in, but that's when they put in tons of biochar. So I don't think you're in danger of doing so. So those are things I know about biochar. I don't know of any. I might have an article or two about biochar from a climate change in the garden section that I did.
Mhm.
Does anybody else want to say anything about biochar? Do you want to tell us stuff, Fran? I bet I just told you what you already know.
No, I didn't know about how this whole thing about surface area that holds nutrients. That's cool.
And it is willing to give them up, apparently.
Yeah.
It's not that good at it, at holding on to them. Well, thank you. I think I'm done up. Somebody? No, Laura, we love the questions. Yay. I'm glad you're coming back. I'm looking forward to next month. And I'll be excited to see you all, whether you are coming to tell us tips or coming to find out about all of these things. If you're new to the area, you might see diseases or pests that you haven't seen before, or you'll find out which are the hard ones here and which are the easy ones to take care of here. Yeah. Does anybody have any last thing to say? You're very welcome, everybody. I'm looking at
Thank
the
you.
chat. Thank
Mhm.
you. Thank you so much. Okay, I will see you the first Tuesday of next month, or in various committees around the island, because we're all like that. We're all meeting in different ways.